They said Africa could never build its own shield. They said the sky would always belong to someone else, to foreign hands, foreign codes, foreign commands. But then, a fire rose over the horizon of Burkina Faso, and the world went silent. That night, as the African sky trembled with light, Ibrahim Traore stood beneath it, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. A man who dared to say, "We will no longer borrow protection, we will create it." For the first time in history, an African-made missile defense test reached the heavens, and the message thundered far beyond the desert winds. Some called it reckless, others called it revolutionary. NATO called an emergency meeting, but to millions watching across the continent, it was something far greater, proof that Africa could defend its own sky, its own destiny. Before we dive deep, hit that subscribe button, because this is not just news, this is a turning point in the story of our people. It began on a quiet morning just outside Ouagadougou. The air was still, the sky pale with dawn. Soldiers moved silently, technicians adjusted their monitors, and in the center of that vast open field stood something the world had never imagined would rise from African soil. A tall silver launcher, marked with the insignia of a new era. African Sky Shield. No grand announcement, no press spectacle, just faith, quiet, steady, unshaken. President Ibrahim Traore, dressed not in gold or medals but in the simplicity of a soldier, gave one single nod. That nod traveled through cables, through circuits, through the breath of a nation, and then the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The echo rolled like a heartbeat through the desert. When the missile broke the horizon, it was more than sound. It was spirit. The roar wasn't just metal cutting through air. It was centuries of silence breaking open. For the first time, an African-made defense system reached into the sky, and the sky answered. The radar tracked flawlessly. The guidance system held firm. The missile locked on a simulated threat, and impact. Precise. Controlled. Successful. Burkina Faso, the same nation once dismissed as one of the poorest in the world, had just executed a successful missile defense test. And for the people, it wasn't about war. It was about dignity. Crowds gathered near the capital, waving flags, shouting Traore's name. "Burkina Faso did it," they said. "We did it, for all of Africa." The older ones wept. They remembered the decades when African skies were patrolled by someone else's drones, someone else's commands, someone else's protection. But now, this was their own. International media hesitated. Some questioned whether it was real. Others whispered about Russian engineers or secret partnerships. But what they missed was the deeper truth. This moment wasn't about where the parts came from. It was about where the pride came from. For years, the nations of the Sahel had been told they could not defend themselves, that they needed foreign troops, foreign intelligence, foreign mercy. Yet here was Ibrahim Traore, standing tall under the African sun, declaring, "We will protect our land, our people, and our sky with our own hands." That statement echoed across the continent, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Lagos to Luanda. It was no longer just a launch. It was a signal. Even in Europe, defense analysts exchanged worried glances. Could this small, landlocked nation truly possess that level of sophistication? Could this be the beginning of a new African military age? The truth is, the African Sky Shield was more than a weapon. It was a message, a declaration that Africa's time of dependency was ending. And somewhere in Brussels, in a NATO conference room, filled with quiet tension, a diplomat whispered, "We need to reassess Burkina Faso." Because when one small nation finds its courage, It forces every empire to question its control. But this was just the beginning. What came after the launch would shake the balance of power far beyond the Sahel. As the smoke cleared and the missile's echo faded, the world wasn't clapping. It was calculating. And NATO was about to make its move. When the news broke, it traveled faster than sound, not through the sky, but through the wires, the airwaves, the whispers of diplomats and journalists who could hardly believe what they were hearing. Burkina Faso has successfully tested a missile defense system. For a brief moment, silence hung over the world's military networks. Then, like thunder, came the responses. In Brussels, the NATO Situation Room went from calm to chaos. Screens lit up with maps of West Africa. Military analysts leaned forward, voices trembling as they replayed the footage, that single missile slicing through the blue, steady, unbroken. "How?" one official demanded. "Who helped them?" The question echoed across the Atlantic. Washington called for briefings. Paris demanded explanations. London released a cautious statement about regional stability, but in the streets of Ouagadougou, no one cared for diplomatic wording. There, the people sang. Dancers filled the roads, waving the red and green flag under the fierce African sun. They shouted, "Traore!" not as a politician's name, but as a prayer, a declaration that their nation had risen. Western media scrambled for narratives. Some said Russia was behind it. Others blamed Chinese influence. A few tried to downplay it as a symbolic test. Yet behind closed doors, generals and think tanks spoke differently. The words strategic shift and loss of Western influence in the Sahel began appearing in classified memos. NATO intelligence reports described Ibrahim Traore as a nationalist with military vision and regional impact. But for many in Africa, those words sounded like the beginning of a new chapter, not of fear, but of faith. Because for decades, Africa's strength was measured in minerals, not mines, in exports, not innovation. Now one nation had defied that definition. In a tense press conference, a NATO spokesperson declared, "We are concerned about the proliferation of advanced weaponry in unstable regions." But the people of Burkina Faso heard something different. They heard, "We are concerned that you are no longer under our control." On social media, the phrase "African Sky Shield" trended across the continent. Students in Ghana and Nigeria painted the Burkinabe flag on their arms. In Bamako, Mali, a mural appeared overnight. Traore's face surrounded by doves and missiles under the words, "Our sky, our right." And while Western analysts argued about alliances, African elders simply smiled. They had seen this pattern before. Every time Africa stood up, someone tried to push it back down. But this time, the ground beneath their feet felt stronger. The preacher's voice rises. You can't suppress a people once they've seen the horizon. You can't control a continent once it's tasted self-belief. The world can sanction weapons, but it can't sanction pride. And pride, that dangerous, beautiful word, was spreading faster than any missile. Ibrahim Traore became more than a name. He became an idea, a call for African nations to trust their own engineers, their own soldiers, their own destiny. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed new defense pacts. A new term appeared in headlines: the Sahel Alliance. What began as one test in the desert had turned into a movement. But movements attract eyes and enemies. In the corridors of NATO headquarters, one advisor leaned over a table and said quietly, "If we don't act now, Africa will build its own order, without us." And that sentence changed everything. Because when old powers feel their grip loosen, they don't just observe, they intervene. As Burkina Faso celebrated beneath its new sky, unseen forces began to move in the shadows. The test had ended, but the struggle for control was only beginning. In the days that followed the test, the world shifted, quietly but undeniably. In Ouagadougou, markets buzzed with stories. Children played with paper rockets. Elders sat under baobab trees, telling each other that Africa had finally touched the sky. The government buildings of Burkina Faso filled with energy, not arrogance, but purpose. Engineers who had once left the country for better pay abroad began returning home. Young students walked taller. The words "made in Africa" no longer sounded like a dream. And at the heart of it all stood Ibrahim Traore, the soldier who had become a symbol of self-reliance. He spoke not with triumph, but with clarity. Our mission is not to dominate. Our mission is to defend. A shield, not a sword. That phrase echoed across Africa. From Accra to Addis Ababa, people began asking, if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? But as the pride spread, so did pressure. Sanctions whispered at the edge of policy rooms. Western aid proposals paused for review. Contracts delayed, partnerships canceled. The same pattern that history had written 100 times before. Every time Africa stood up, the world found a way to make it stumble. And yet, something was different this time. The people didn't break. They built. Local manufacturing in Burkina Faso surged. Universities opened defense technology departments. Neighboring Mali and Niger signed new cooperative security agreements, forming what they called the Sahel Shield. Burkina Faso's national budget, once reliant on foreign aid, began to pivot toward domestic innovation. Small factories produced radar parts, sensors, protective shells, not imported, but crafted by African hands. And the people saw it. They saw the fruit of faith. In the West, analysts kept debating whether the African Sky Shield was real or symbolic, or a clever PR move. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, symbolism was reality. A grandmother in the market said it best. Even if that missile never flew, our hearts already did. Those words became a slogan, painted on walls, printed on shirts, whispered in prayers. But progress is a dangerous miracle. It draws admiration, and it draws attack. Reports began to surface of foreign drones spotted along the border, cyber attacks on communication systems, disinformation campaigns claiming the test was a fake. Burkina Faso's rise was not just a story of invention, it was a test of endurance. And through it all, Traore remained calm. He reminded his people of patience, unity, and vigilance. The shield, he said, is not only in the sky, it is in our hearts, and no weapon can destroy that. Yet even as he spoke, rumors grew of covert operations, of powers determined to reassert control over the Sahel. Economists warned of rising costs. Politicians debated alliances, and in the quiet corners of global diplomacy, lines were being drawn, those who supported African autonomy and those who feared it. Still, despite all threats, hope lived. Because this time, the pride wasn't built on a politician's promise. It was built on proof. The missile had flown. The world had watched. And the people had believed. The preacher's voice softens. Every revolution begins in the heart before it ever reaches the sky. The question now is, will the world allow Africa to keep its faith? Or will it try to take it away again? As the drums of celebration turned into whispers of tension, one question remained. Can a small nation keep its shield when giants start to notice? Tell us in the comments, do you believe Burkina Faso can protect what it has built? Or will the old powers find a way to break the dream? Far from Ouagadougou, In the cold rooms of Washington and Brussels, the atmosphere was uneasy. They called it a regional test. But the truth, whispered behind closed doors, was simpler. Africa had just redefined the game. In the Pentagon, analysts replayed footage frame by frame. How did Burkina Faso achieve this? Was Russia's shadow behind it? Or had the West simply underestimated the spirit of nations it once called developing? Across Europe, media headlines mixed caution with disbelief. Burkina Faso's bold leap, one paper read. Sahel rising, NATO on edge, wrote another. The tone varied. Some praised, others warned. But beneath every article, one fear pulsed quietly. If they can do it, who's next? Because that's what power fears most. Not enemies, but examples. A single act of independence can ripple like thunder across continents. In Moscow, the story was different. Russian state channels called the test a triumph of sovereignty. In Beijing, commentators spoke of a new model for South-South cooperation. And across Africa, leaders of Niger, Mali, Chad, and even Ghana publicly applauded Ibrahim Traore, calling him a son of the continent who dared. But in Washington, the tone hardened. The term Sahel alignment appeared in classified assessments. Economic advisors discussed containment through investment control. It was the language of old empires, reshaped for modern times. The preacher's voice grows stronger. They call it stability, but what they mean is silence. They call it cooperation, but what they want is control. For decades, Africa's story had been told to the world, not by the world. But now, through Burkina Faso, through Traore's audacity, the script was shifting. No longer the continent of pity, but of power. No longer the land of extraction, but of expression. And the world, for the first time in a long time, had to listen. Yet, in the corridors of global diplomacy, the tension grew. Will this spark unity or conflict? Will Africa's rise inspire partnerships or provoke resistance? Because every light casts a shadow. And while the African sky shield glowed like a beacon of hope, some feared it could also become a target. The sky had changed, yes, but beneath that same sky, new storms were forming, and Traore was already planning his next move. The dust from the missile launch had long settled, but its echo still traveled across the continent. Weeks turned to months, and yet the name Ibrahim Traore was still on the lips of young Africans, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Ghana, in Senegal, in South Africa. Because what he ignited was not just a system of defense. It was a system of belief. The African Sky Shield had proven one thing, that progress does not come from permission, it comes from conviction. Traore's next move was not about building more missiles. It was about building minds. He launched programs to train engineers, scientists, and cybersecurity experts, young men and women who would carry the torch of African defense into a new century. He urged the universities of Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso to partner with schools across the Sahel, and he spoke of a dream, not of war, but of unity. The shield we build today must protect not only our land, but our hope. A free Africa must also be a learned Africa. Meanwhile, across the region, the Sahel Alliance began taking shape. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger joined hands, sharing technology, intelligence, and vision. Their slogan was simple, powerful, and ancient: one sky, one destiny. And beyond the politics, a quiet cultural shift began. Children no longer drew soldiers with foreign flags. They drew scientists with African ones. Local radio stations replaced imported jingles with poems about freedom and strength. Even the elders, the ones who had seen too many promises broken, began to whisper, maybe this time. It will last. But Traore knows, hope is never safe. Empires do not sleep when their influence fades. The price of self-determination is eternal vigilance. He stands on a balcony overlooking the capital as the sun sets, and his voice, low but steady, carries over the wind. They may control satellites, but we control spirit. They may build weapons, but we build will. The preacher's tone deepens, because in the end, the greatest shield is not made of steel or code. It is made of courage. And that courage, that African courage, was awakening in every corner of the continent. So, what comes next? Will the world embrace an Africa that stands tall, or try to silence it again? One thing is certain, the sky will never look the same again. There comes a moment in every nation's journey when the world stops seeing it as a follower and begins to see it as a force. For Africa, that moment began when Ibrahim Traore dared to lift his eyes to the heavens and say, "We too shall guard our sky." It was not arrogance, it was awakening, because every generation must find its voice, and this time, that voice rose from the red soil of Burkina Faso, not as an echo of the past, but as the rhythm of tomorrow. The African sky shield was never just about missiles or machinery. It was a mirror, reflecting what Africa could be when it stopped asking for permission and started believing in itself. Across the continent, farmers, teachers, and elders began to speak a new language, the language of confidence. Young minds looked up to the stars and no longer saw limits. They saw opportunity, invention, and pride. And though headlines may fade, though Burkina Faso news may one day move on to another story, the truth remains. A spark has been lit. Empires can suppress armies, they can blockade economies, but they cannot bury a dream whose time has come. The preacher's voice rises. Stand tall, Africa. Let the world see not your wounds, but your wisdom. Let them know that your silence was not weakness, it was waiting. Because every missile that rose that night was not aimed at enemies, it was aimed at doubt, at dependency, at the centuries of disbelief that said you could not. And when it struck, it didn't destroy, it awakened. So remember this, the shield may have a name, Ibrahim Traore, but its meaning belongs to all of Africa. The sky will remember. History will remember. And someday, your grandchildren will ask, where were you when Africa built its own destiny? If you believe in that destiny, don't just watch it happen. Be part of it. Share this story, stand for the truth, and subscribe to keep this voice alive. Because this isn't just defense. This is deliverance.